Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Voice of Islam Living History program. In this series of programs, we're looking at ideas and particular people that have helped shape mankind's direction and many of the things that we appreciate in our day-to-day living. We looked in the previous program at how our ideas about cosmology, our origins, have been shaped from ancient times up to the modern era. We looked at the contributions made by religious thinking in how we came to being, how humankind came to inhabit this planet, and some of the contradictions and divisions between what science thinks and what religion thinks. In today's program, we're going to look at, in this second part of the program, we're going to look at what science has taught us in what our world is like. And I'm joined by our expert panel, Amjad Hussain Sahab and Arif again. Assalamu alaikum to both of you.
Wa alaikum salam. Thanks for having me in.
In the last program, as I was saying, Amjad and Arif, we looked at really the way the scientific view of the world has developed, going up to Einstein and Darwin, and really some of the conflicts that happened between science and religion as well. But now, of course, many in the West are quite skeptical about the religious input into how our universe came into being. There's a view, I suppose, that religion is outdated and science really explains everything. Before we go into some of the divisions and then later on touch on how Islam actually tries to explain how the universe came into being, let's talk about science and the scientific method. I'm sure Amjad will come in and we'll talk about what we know about the world we live in. But tell me, Arif, a little bit about the scientific method. How does science establish something as a fact and move on?
Well, it's a vast area, and I'm sure most of us have studied science at school. Maybe a lot of us don't really remember what we were studying. But in essence, scientific knowledge, this is information and knowledge that has been built up over many, many centuries. From this, we're able to formulate, or scientists are able to formulate laws. And these laws are able to be verified and not falsified. And you're able to test these laws. So what happens is that you can do experiments. You know, we've all done scientific experiments, and these prove laws. And sometimes these laws can then be formulated into statements or into equations. And again, I'm sure some of us remember some of these very complicated or simple scientific equations that we have. As well as scientific laws, they can be hypotheses or theories or postulates. And these are things that scientists will use to try and develop an idea. So if you look at one of the basic scientific laws, many of you may have remembered a law about the conservation of energy. And again, it's a very simple one that basically, if you have energy, the total amount of energy that you have in a system, it can't be destroyed. It can be conserved over time. And if you look at something very simple like a stick of dynamite, inside that dynamite there is kinetic energy, chemical energy, and when that blows up, it gets converted into sound, it gets converted into heat, but the total energy is preserved. And so that's one of those scientific laws that's always protected and there. Building on from that, you might have then a postulate, and that's something which is taken to be true. So for example, very, very similar, you might say there are 2 points and you can draw a straight line between any 2 points. And then from there, people will then develop ideas and theories. And so what scientists try and do is they use the observable information they have, they build laws, and they test these laws. Now, another interesting thing is that a law can be actually changed by future observations. So there may be some information that you have, and then maybe centuries later you're able to observe something different, and that might mean that you actually change these laws. So science, like anything else, is constantly evolving, constantly changing, but there are basic principles that scientists try and follow.
Amjad, you're obviously a trained scientist and love science deeply, I know, with many of our discussions. But interestingly, as we noted in our earlier program, very early on, a lot of people were religiously inclined, but also had a scientific insight as well. But one of the things that differentiates, I suppose, the scientific method from religious view or etc. is the ability to be able to test, experiment and verify it. And the Muslims played a major part in that, because the early Greeks, even, who were great thinkers, they were speculative. They had all sorts of ideas. But it was the Arabs that really came along to say, okay, this is a theory, this should be tested, and this can be verified. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you brought in the Greeks. I mean, Plato, for instance, conjectures that women are inferior because they have slightly less number of teeth than men do. And all he needed to do was, to verify that statement, is to look at Mrs. Plato's number of teeth. And that is just basically what, philosophy and conjecture and then experimentation is. You have an hypothesis or you want to make an assertion, and then you can make that back that assertion up with actual physical facts. And moving on, of course, Muslims very much realize earlier on that from the philosophical ideas of, for instance, the Kalam cosmological arguments that, for instance, God created the universe and now is come into being, kun fayakun, something is created, so it must have a creator. And they realize that we can go inwards into our batin or the hidden aspects, spirituality, metaphysics, and, reach a higher reality and so on. But dealing with the physical phenomena, they realize this is creation of God itself. So by experimenting and by looking at this phenomena of nature itself, we can become closer to God. So hence they started experimentation. So hence that gave rise to very prominent scientists like the author of, for instance, the Book of Optics, which Newton used subsequently for his works, Ibn al-Haytham. Then we have Geber on chemistry and so forth, and Ibn Sina on medicine. Ibn Rushd was a polymath. These were all polymaths, and they were desire basically to look at the creation of God itself, the natural phenomena, and become closer to God. The more you look at nature, the more reality of Lord and the Creator manifests itself.
And I think in many ways it was their faith in the Holy Quran, and that also guided them, which sadly in the Western scientific viewpoint changed because their culture was dictated to by a different book, etc. But in the last program we sort of took our listeners up to the current viewpoint, and clearly we know roughly 15 billion years ago the universe came into being. I want you to take our listeners through this journey from what we know of established fact from all the different physicists, chemists, biologists, etc. And I want them to go on this journey with us before I bring religion into it and what Islam teaches us and where there is any divergence or whether they come together. So just take us through this journey with the formation of the
forgive me,
fall.
I mean, just one small correction, and I think you said 15 billion, but
Roughly.
I think now there was a data that we collected in 2012 from what we call the WMAP probe, from the cosmic wave background radiation, and that now tells us, looking at the most distant stars and the light spectrum and so on, and analyzing other various data, scientists have pinpointed the age of the universe to be around 13.8.
It's much closer. I said roughly. That's why I use the word roughly.
Give or take 16 million years, of course. There is an error in that measurement, but actually, we talk about the Big Bang, and Big Bang is actually the theory of what came after the bang. But nobody, at the fundamental level, nobody knows what really happened at time zero. It's still a very much conjecture. However, scientists think they can pick up the story up to about 10 to the minus 36 of a second, and that is 1 trillionth of a trillionth of a trillionth of a second after the bang. And that's what they call basically these minute fractions of time, what they call Planck time. So like I said, the very beginning of the universe remains pretty much a mystery. And of course, since the Big Bang, the universe has passed through many different phases of epochs. Each, due to the extreme conditions and the violence of its very early stage, it is argued that it is arguably, we see a lot more activity during this first second than the billion years later. So much of all that really have we today, the matter, antimatter, and the galaxies, and all these various forces that we talk about, the big four forces, that Big Bang.
Those four forces basically shaped our current universe from its very origins at the Big Bang point and onwards. So just take us through very briefly. If you get too detailed, I will obviously intervene because listeners obviously not as expert as you, but go on.
So still dealing with these billionth and billionth and billionth of a second, very, baby, early, embryonic, seconds, these seconds, these four forces were, as one, they were unified. And the four big four forces are your gravity, electromagnetism, the weak force and the hard force. We all know
strong nuclear force.
The strong nuclear
yeah,
force
yeah,
and
yeah.
the hard, the strong and the weak. Yeah, the weak is what is responsible for what we call, the beta decay or radioactivity. The strong force is what bites and binds atoms together. Electromagnetism, everybody knows, is basically the phenomena that permeates light, carries photon, and so on, and all the electromagnetic properties. So basically, that's they were all unified at this 10 to the minus 46 of a second, and what we call the Planck epoch, and that's approximately 10 to the 43 seconds. This is the closest the physics can get to absolute beginning of time, and very little, like I said, is known about this period. But what we think is that general relativity proposes, out of the work of Einstein, it proposes that there existed a gravitational singularity that's about the size of a pinhead. And at that time, you can imagine this pinhead being the tip of a pencil, standing upright symmetrically, and the point pointing upwards, and that's how they basically describe that point.
So from when you move, so those are the laws that govern it, and then the various particles. I mean, there are so many funny names and so many. You as a scientist will know all these leptons and quarks and this and that. And me being an old scientist, remember the days of the electron, proton, and so and so.
Oh, absolutely. So this is basically around 10 to the minus 36. So I said, 10 to the minus 43 seconds is when all these things started. At time 10 to the minus 36, these forces separated out, and basically out of gravity remained. Out of that, four forces emerged, and that also period is called the inflationary period. It was triggered by separation of the strong nuclear force. The universe underwent extreme rapid exponential expansion known as cosmic inflation, and the linear dimensions of the early universe increased in this tiny fraction of time by a factor of at least 10 to the minus 26 to around 10 centimeter, about the size of a big grapefruit. And the elementary particles remaining from this grand unification epoch, this hot, dense, what we call quark gluon plasma, sometimes known as the quark soup, became distributed very thinly across the universe. At about 10 to the minus 12 of a second, the weak electroforce separated from the strong electroforce, and so these two forces basically became separated. Particle interactions created extra number of exotic particles, things like the W and the Z bosons. And the W and the Z bosons are what Professor Abdul Salam, if you listeners know,
the God particle that people kept on talking about.
The God particle came after.
Yeah.
So basically, the W and the Z came, and the W and the Z are basically the two particles that are responsible for the weak force and so on. And there was also the Higgs boson. Basically, Higgs boson is when it's a type of a field. So basically, it gave rise to the masses of all these exotic. We have these hundreds of exotic particles. We call them basically leptons, fermions, and so on and so forth.
Just for our listeners, I mean, a lot of them will be asking, how do we know this information? How are we able to observe this? And from my very limited understanding, this is based on the light that was emitted at the time of the Big Bang. Is that correct? And is this what we can still observe today?
Yes, what we can actually observe is what we call the afterglow of the universe, afterglow of the Big Bang, and that because obviously afterglow of the Big Bang now we see in the cosmic this cosmic background radiation we see basically in the microwave region. And if you look at the microwave region, it's really close to our radio waves. Our radio waves, our radar waves. Where we and basically then television. Then we get short wave, medium wave, and long wave. But obviously, when the universe started, it was megahertz. So you're looking at the X-ray region. So it's been cooling ever since. The more it expands, and the energy drops down, and so basically moving all the way microwave, beyond the X-ray region, cosmic.
So something that happened 13.8 billion years
13.8,
ago, we can still see the effects of
I mean,
it.
the interesting thing is...
interesting, when you flick over your radio and you get the hiss, that's really the cosmic... and also you observe that on your television channel, when you're hopping channels, if you remember the old analog version of transmissions, and you had all these flies on your TV screen, that is actually the physical manifestation of the afterglow of the Big Bang, and it's everywhere throughout the universe. You can't miss it.
Just to add to Arif's point, I mean, one of the good things about science is that you have all these ideas, but you can test them, prove them. So CERN, which is probably the biggest center where they collide at massively fast speeds, all these different particles, and they find them and they describe them, whatever. So that's how they can never get to the very original temperatures and power, forces that are required, but that's how they test them.
They're trying to recreate
the
universe.
Situation. What we can go actually back to is what we call the lepton epoch, which is 1 to the 3 minutes, time. So basically, after the majority, but not all of the hadrons and anti-hadrons, they came about and they annihilated each other at the end of a hadron epoch. You're saying, what are leptons? Leptons are basically electrons, and anti-leptons are things like positrons. So you've got electron and a positron. Electron they both have the same mass, but they have opposite charge. And they dominated the early part of the universe. As soon as things cooled down, so basically the quarks coalesced in the nucleus, the binding energy took over, and then temperatures sufficiently cooled down, so the electron was captured by the atom. So basically, we have at the very beginning of now is basically the synthesis of the nucleus. So we call this the nuclear synthesis. So this is so
hydrogen being the very first.
So hydrogen was formed around 3 to 20 minutes.
And that was such a big development, wasn't it? Really, from there the movement developed. So really, from all these particles, with all these laws acting, you had the formation of hydrogen, and then hydrogen to helium was another important stage. And the universe has been governed by the balance between these two gases.
So basically, when the early universe on this pinhead, when we said, the Big Bang, that was trillions and trillions of, Celsius. Now we've come down to temperature still. When I said cooling down,
relative.
It's a relative term. They cooled down to about 1 billion degrees, you can imagine. That's when these things were formed. And the protons and the neutrons coalesced, they combined, and the electrons was captured in the nucleus of the atom, and formed from the basic atom, basic building blocks, which were basically your first elements, hydrogen and helium and lithium, for instance, about 20 minutes after the whole.
This is the interesting thing, Arif, because I'm sure when you go back to your school days, because obviously Amjad is a trained scientist, do you remember the periodic table we used to all have?
Yes.
So you had hydrogen, helium, you had all these tables. I never actually in my school days understood and knew where they all came from.
Yeah.
And now we know.
Even the name, the periodic, makes sense. Yes.
And now we know that each of those, step by step, was generated in the heart of the stars. You go and share your thoughts and views on that, because we go on to the formation then of galaxies and so in the
Well, I was going to talk about the formation of the solar system, which is obviously.
But that comes later on, really, in a sense, because one of the things, Amjad, that we've come to learn is that the whole universe, right, came from these, from the particles and the gases and the formation of a whole series of the. Do you want to take us through before we come to the solar system?
Before that, we missed some important ones. One is the formation of photon. That's basically that's the particle responsible for light. So after 3 minutes to about 240,000 years, this particle emerged, and during this long period of gradual cooling, again, cooling is relative. The universe is filled with plasma, hot and opaque soup of these atomic nucleus and electrons. So, like I said, all these basic elements are there, and so forth. So you have basically, gravity takes over sufficiently, and then early stars are born. And thus basically formation happens around that time, and then obviously there is the inflation period I mentioned, so from 300 to 500 million years onward, gravity amplifies the slight irregularities in the density of primordial gases, and pockets of gas comes more and more dense.
Gravity starts acting on them and coalescing.
As the universe continues to expand rapidly, these small dense clouds of cosmic gas starts to collapse under its own gravity, becoming hot enough to trigger nuclear fusion reactions between hydrogen atoms, creating the very first stars. These early stars, are short-lived, and they become massive superstars. Giant stars, hundreds and hundreds of times massive than our own sun. So we call these, population 3. They're metal-free stars, and basically these stars begin to form, and material from previous round of stars making processes throws out these giant, gas clouds, and these ashes are scattered throughout this, primordial early universe.
So this is where we come to then our solar system, Arif, and obviously our galaxy is the.
Arif can lead on to this. So basically, we had these very fundamental elements like hydrogen and helium. People say, where did all these other stuff come from? It's basically product of stardust. All these heavy metals were synthesized.
Nucleosynthesis.
In the heart of the stars, and supernovae threw these things to the vast.
Because without them, really, we wouldn't have everything that was needed on Earth. So that leads nicely into
absolutely. So these materials, which were basically the clouds of dust and gas, and we're moving forward to say only 4.6 billion years ago, which sounds
it's a long time ago, 13 billion years ago.
So we've gone from 13.8 billion years ago to 4.6 billion years ago. And as Amjad Sab has very eloquently described, the materials, the building blocks of the solar system were there. So these were dust, these were gases, and this one of the mainly accepted theories, the one around the solar nebula. And so let's just try and explain that in simple terms. There was a giant molecular cloud, and as we described, gravity, the gravitational collapse of this cloud helped to start forming the solar system. And at the center of that was the sun, as we see it today, and the rest of it flattened out into a disk of planets, moons, asteroids, and all the other various bodies that we see in the solar system. And I think the best way of describing it is as the sun was formed, the remaining material that was left in the solar system, that started to clump together. So the smaller particles, they came together, and the gravity formed these into larger particles. And the lighter particles, the solar wind is also a very, very important part of the creation of the universe. That blew the other items away. So like the hydrogen and the helium, because that was lighter, that was blown away. So the heavier items, the rocks, these came together, and these formed these terrestrial planets.
Absolutely, like things like iron, obviously, they are heavy, and hydrogen and helium and so on. So people say, where does iron come from? Obviously, out of this iron settled. These are a lot, and uranium and other heavy metals, and they coalesced in the center of these, little protoplanets and so on. And obviously, some planets haven't quite become rocky. We see these giants, Saturn and Uranus and Jupiter, of course. These are gas giants, and these are actually failed suns. Because they're not massive enough as our sun, and obviously the gravity didn't quite take over, and nuclear reaction didn't start. So they basically failed suns, and they basically were trapped around the central.
I mean, you were talking about the gases, and of course, one of the most important, oxygen, formation of oxygen. Without that, life on Earth, with combination with hydrogen, water will go in onto that. So obviously, most of our kids have grown up with this notion, with sun in the center and our planets, and then you have obviously the rocky inner planets and the gaseous outer planets as well.
And also with this as well, particularly, for example, on Earth, the magnetic field is forming, also the tectonic plates. So you see even today there's different layers to the Earth, as we know. There's a hotter in its core, the mantle, and then the plates, which are sort of the land masses that are nowadays there on the top, and then also the rocks and the mountains as well. So in some ways it's difficult to know how this was planned and designed in such a way, but we see that design still today, that there is actually a layering of the Earth. There are different components of the Earth, and these have all come together to form what we're living on today.
I mean, it's an incredible story, isn't it? Because this is what I wanted the listeners to pick up a little bit of how it all started. And when you look at planet Earth as well, and you look at Venus, same size, but such a different makeup for life to obviously develop. And then you mentioned the gaseous planets, because one of the interesting things is, people think, well, we've got a planet, thank God for that, and that's it. But interesting thing about the Jupiter, which we've learned recently with all these comets and asteroids coming in and how it acts as a vacuum. Do you want to?
Oh, absolutely, because it's got massive gravity and these comets. Another thing I want to basically talk about is with certain people, our listeners, I think those who study science at a slightly higher level will know that now I think Pluto's back into being not a renegade planet anymore. It's a fully fledged planet now. And so the end of our solar system is what we call actually the Oort cloud. The Oort cloud is beyond. It's like millions and millions of miles in beyond Pluto, and that has loads of asteroids in it. And obviously some of them get disturbed and they get pulled into the inner solar system. And there's always a danger that basically they'll collide into one planet or another. So these outer, Uranus, Neptune, Saturn, Jupiter, they are humongously giant planets, and they act as vacuum cleaners of the solar system. So most of them, if you're old enough to remember, and if you're watching television, 10 years ago, there was Schumacher-Levy,
yes,
one of the biggest,
absolutely.
Schumacher-Levy, and that crashed into the Jupiter, and you could see it on if you were terrestrial-based telescopes. So these giant impacts. But if that was actually to crash on our on Earth, it would be end of life as we know it.
Because interesting thing is, the scientists have done such a marvelous job at trying to explain how life on Earth and ourselves have come to being. Is early on you had such a bombardment. That's why you see a lot of the craters on the moon as well, and you saw that on Earth. But eventually you had a cooling down period, and the big gaseous planets started sucking away the dangerous asteroid meteorites, and then the formation of water, and then the greenery, and then the various forms of development of evolution, and finally Homo sapiens as well. And that's an interesting journey, probably to be covered in a totally different program. So science has shown us through so many different studies how life has come to be, how our Earth has come to be. And in the second part of the program, I want us to now focus on, okay, that's what science tells us, and this is established. There's lots of theories that are wild and all sorts. It's about what established science has told us. And how does that fit in with what the religion, in particular Islam, teaches? I'm not going to deal with the other religions because that's for each scholar and theologian of their religious school to present. But certainly from the Quranic and Islamic point of view, is there conflict between what science and religion teach, or do they come together? And what have some of the great Muslim scholars said about these things? So I hope listeners have found the first part interesting, and inshallah, in the second part, we will really link religion and science and see what we understand.
You're listening to the Voice of Islam Radio, broadcasting on DAB and via the internet 24 hours a day.
Welcome back to the Voice of Islam Living History program. This is the second part of our discussion around the origins of the universe and mankind and what science and religion say about that. So in the first part, Amjad and Arif, we talked about what science has taught us. In this part of the program, I want to focus on what the Holy Quran and Islam in particular say about our origins, and whether that contradicts science or whether it's in line with established scientific fact. And I make a clear point on that. It's about established scientific fact. Interesting thing is the Holy Quran, with its 114 chapters, is a religious book for guidance for mankind, largely spiritual guidance, moral, spiritual guidance. But the Quran also seeks to create faith in God through reflection and contemplation of God's signs in the universe, ranging from astronomy, geology, ecology, biology, and physics as well. The Quran instructs Muslims and mankind generally to study nature and the physical laws so that man may be able to understand God better. And in order to do this, furnishes over 750 verses compared to, say, 250 that are to do with social and moral development as well. So this is an important fact that a lot of people do not know, and for those of our listeners out there should appreciate. Amjad, you want to interject, because the Holy Quran makes specific mentions.
Absolutely. Just for introduction, obviously the Quran is not a book of science. It doesn't intend to be. It's a book of guidance for mankind, how we live our social lives and so forth. But however, in light of this, it calls upon mankind to reflect upon themselves and generally the creation of God out there. And it gives evidence which is absolutely not contradictory to modern science. And the Holy Quran mentions in Surah 41, verse 54, we will show them our signs in the universe and within themselves until it becomes manifest unto them that this indeed, i.e. the Quran, is the truth.
Now that's interesting. Throughout the Holy Quran, there are instructions to mankind to study nature and to then understand how God, the originator. Arif, turning to yourself, obviously in the modern West, when you go to schools and universities, they're very negative about any concept of a creator being, and we discuss the laws of science, etc., and what science has taught us, and there's a belief in blind random development, etc. But this is where the Islamic faith and Holy Quran is very different in how the universe has come into being.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we want to encourage people to find out for themselves. So we're going to quote some verses, and just to go back to the first part of the program, we talked about the origin of the universe, and it's quite a more or less a universally accepted principle for modern scientists that the Earth developed out of this gaseous mass and a cloud. And if you take that and you then look at what the Holy Quran says, so I'm going to read out 3 or 4 verses, with your permission, from chapter 41, starting from verse 10. And in verse 10, it's written in the Holy Quran, say, do you really disbelieve in him who created the earth in 2 days? And do you set up equals with him? That is the Lord of the worlds. So here first Allah is saying that, he is the creator. In verse 11 it goes on to say, he placed therein firm mountains rising above its surface, and blessed it with abundance, and provided therein its foods in proper measure in 4 days, alike for all seekers. Then he turned to the heaven, while it was like smoke, and said to it and to the earth, come ye both of you in obedience, willingly or unwillingly. They said, we come willingly in obedience. So he completed them into 7 heavens in 2 days, and he revealed to each heaven its function, and we adorned the lowest heaven with lamps for light, and provided it with means of protection. That is the decree of the mighty, the all-knowing. So there's a very, just in these 4 verses, for me, there's a very, very clear concept of Allah being the creator, but actually specifying in quite detail both the length of the time. So, for example, these 6 days, which we can relate to 6 periods about the creation of the earth. And this is not in any contradiction to any scientific principle. And just to read, some of the comments of some of the, geologists. So, for example, Dr. Alfred Kroner, who's a professor of geology, he said, thinking of where Mohammed, peace be upon him, came from, I think it is almost impossible that he could have known about things like the common origin of the universe, because scientists have only found out about it in the last few years with very complicated and advanced technological methods. And somebody who did not know something about nuclear physics 1400 years ago could not be in a position to find this out from his own mind. So it prevents the evidence, and also scientists today have to recognize that these statements are very much in line and contradict not whatsoever the theory of the origin of the universe.
Amjad, the word day, quite commonly used in a lot of translations, I think it's misunderstood, don't you? Because I think the real term, and we talked in the previous program of how time actually is measured. We measure our day based on our sun and rotation of the earth, etc. But what is time?
Absolutely, time is relative, as the great man himself, Albert Einstein, tells us. It's is relative to the observer, and you quite rightly mentioned our days. 12 hours day and night, 24 hours, because we measure this our Earth going around the sun. But obviously, different observers in different part of the universe, there are different lengths of time and lengths of day. So time itself is relative to the observer. However, in the Holy Quran, it mentions that the days of the Lords are of multitude. So here, when the Lord says the word yom is used, or ayam, is plural. So days, is multitudes of days. So here the Lord is speaking in terms of eons.
Yeah. I mean, there are great verses in the Holy Quran, and I can't remember exactly which verse it is, but it says, one day could translate to your 50,000 years.
Millions.
And so this is about eons, and it's about periods, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So it's very, very important when we look at some of these translations that there have been phases, periods during which the universe and life on Earth has been developed as well. There's another thing I wanted to talk about, Amjad, and you mentioned the laws of nature, the laws of physics that determine how the universe came into being. And one of the teachings that's central to Islam and the teaching of the Holy Quran is God created angels as well. So, and I think there is a very interesting link between the laws of nature and angels.
Absolutely. I mean, these angels follow God's commandments. These can be forces of nature. The major forces, as we mentioned in our previous program, was gravity, electromagnetism, weak force, and the hard force. And these are universal forces. So basically, the angels of the Lord carry forth, other missions on behalf of the Lord. They bring messengers. So we know electromagnetism carries messages. We permeate our messages. For instance, this very voice broadcast itself is being carried. I mean, I'm sitting in a radio studio, and our listeners are listening over a radio. So this is basically now being permeated through electromagnetic spectrum. Similarly, we know of, for instance, of Angel Gabriel's, and he brings forth messages of the Lord to the prophets, and we know that he brought messages, and the Holy Quran itself to the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam.
Now, there's another interesting concept about science and religion, and we talked about it in one of our previous episodes as well. The very first revelation of the Holy Quran, or the revelation to the Holy Prophet ﷺ, dealt in Surah recite in the name of thy Lord who created. Now, quite often, a lot of people, again, translate that created from a clot of blood. But actually, the Arabic term refers to something that clings.
Yes.
And when you think about it, human beings are created from an embryo that clings in the womb and goes on. So this is, and you mentioned about some of the scientists.
Well, let me just read again the verses, and then people can start to form their own judgments. So this is taken from chapter 23, and the verses are verses 13 to 15. And it said, "Verily we created man from an extract of clay.
Yeah.
Then we placed him as a drop of sperm in a safe depository. Then we fashioned the sperm into a clot. Then we fashioned the clot into a shapeless lump. Then we fashioned bones out of this shapeless lump. Then we clothed the bones with flesh. Then we developed it into another creation. So blessed be Allah, the best of creators." Now, if you just go through those words and that stage of development, that absolutely mirrors the development of the embryo.
Absolutely.
And again, if you look at the scientific theories in terms of how they felt that people developed, it wasn't until only a few hundred years ago that these theories were basically following, I believe, what the Holy Quran is saying. So it shows that there's no contradiction, in my mind at least, between what is said in the Holy Quran and how man is formed. And I remember many years ago somebody telling me that one of the very, very early stages of the development of man is that man was formed in perfect with all of his hands and feet and bones in a miniature size.
From Aristotle's time, this was commonly thought.
And then he would grow. Exactly. And now people look upon that and say it's absolutely ridiculous. But can they say that? Can they say the same thing about what it says in the Holy Quran? I don't think so, because the Holy Quran is speaking the truth.
I mean, one of the interesting things about the Holy Quran in Islam is that, unlike Genesis, which is the first chapter of the Bible, it doesn't go step by step about, right? What it does is it takes a subject matter, talks about social moral development, but then also relates it to nature and its development and our reflection upon that. And that's how the verses are spread throughout. So in our understanding of the universe, we have to look through the Holy Quran, what all the different aspects. But let me then go back to the start then. So from an Islamic point of view, God is the originator. So when we talk about the Big Bang, Amjad, yeah? So what we're saying is that, yes, there's been a process as we described in the first part of the program, but the originator was the almighty, powerful being who says, when he says be, through the angels, something comes into being. Go on, take.
Absolutely. In Surah Baqarah, which is chapter 2, verse 117, depending which convention you use, if you include the Bismillah, then it becomes 118. It says, He is the originator of the heavens and the earth, and when He decrees a plan and He says it to be, and it is. And again in chapter 36, verse 82 or 83, it says, His law of creation is such, when He intends a thing, He decrees it to be, and it is. And the word there is kun fayakun, be, and it is. So there are two plans of Allah. One is the Amr of Allah, which is, this is the way where plans are thought about, and khalaq, the creation. So Lord says it to be, and it is. Of course, there is another verse in the Holy Quran that.
I think just one thing as well, just for clarification. Sometimes people think that when Allah says something to be, it happens instantaneously. My understanding is it doesn't necessarily need to happen immediately. It just means that once God has decreed something, it's going to happen. Now, that might take time to be implemented, but nothing can reverse that. So God's plan is there. Some things can be done instantaneously, but some things might take time. Like, for example, the creation of the earth. It didn't happen overnight. Nobody is saying that is the case. But once Allah had decreed it was going to happen, it happened.
Oh, absolutely. It follows processes, and that's the main important thing. And yes, of course, I mean, like I said, Quran is not a book of cosmology, but nevertheless, once it talks about social laws, how we live our life on this planet, it causes us to reflect on God's creation. And it says in chapter 21, verse 30, do not the unbelievers see that the heavenly bodies and the earth were joined together as of one unit of creation before we clothed them asunder, and we made from water every living thing. Will they not believe? So here two very fundamental points. Water as necessary for life itself, and heavens and the earth, all these bodies, all these masses of stuff were joined together, and they were then rent asunder.
I mean, this is, as you explained in the first part, with the singularity, that there was a closed up mass, and it was clove asunder, and then from it came the universe.
So universe, yes, absolutely. And then obviously it went through these eons, billions and billions of years, and then these planets were created around the sun and so forth. And then of course water being essential. So beautifully encapsulates the whole thing from initiation to giving life, and the molecule that's essential for life is water. So the Lord insists that there's something, with this water, life is connected to it. And again, for the reference of the listeners, is verse 21, Surah 21, verse 30, or using the convention of Bismillah, then it's going to be 31.
Yeah, I mean, the other interesting thing is that when we look at the Holy Quran and its description of the universe, etc., it talks about a clear starting point, an origin. And in the first part of the program, we talked for many, many hundreds of years. The conventional thought was that this universe has been infinite. It's been in existence for a long time. And many of the Eastern religions also believed in that. And so up to even Einstein, people carried this wrong notion through, but the Holy Quran was clear that there was an origin, i.e., as the scientists say, the Big Bang.
A starting point, yes.
Yes, and then the other bit. So that was. But another very interesting point, and I can't remember the exact verse, I've got it somewhere in my references. The Holy Quran also talk about, and the Lord continues to expand the universe as well. Now that concept only very recently, Amjad, came into being and understanding that, we live in an expanding universe.
just with the expansion as well. This is again one of those things that sometimes confounds scientists. What I was reading the other day about the acceleration of the growth of the universe is actually increasing. So it's one of those things that people, even scientists, don't fully understand.
I have these relevant verses that you mentioned. The one in particular is 28:88, and it says, and this is basically expanding and disintegrating. There is no God but He. Everything that exists is gradually being expanded or disintegrated except His own self. And then there is another one, and all that is on the earth is subjected to break-up processes, but this does not affect God Himself, because Allah is everlasting and is above the world of change, and He is full of majesty, bounty, and honor. So basically, that we can deduce from that. And then He has subjected the sun and the moon to His laws. Each one runs its own course for a term appointed. He regulates all affairs, explaining His laws in detail, so as to assure you that you are bound to the forces of the law of the One who is your sustainer, and that you cannot escape it.
I mean, the interesting thing again is the Holy Quran touches a lot upon time, the sun, the moon, the stars, and how they work, etc. And there are these references in other religious books as well, but that's where the contradictions and conflicts have taken place. And one of the ways to, I suppose, to look at the Quran in a book that was there over 1500 years ago is to say, well, what's being said about these celestial bodies and how does it relate to current science? And the interesting thing is virtually every author that I've read says that it's written in line with what is known scientifically as well. So in a sense, you can use the established scientific fact as a proof that this is something divine, something different and special, that you shouldn't have to believe blindly that it is the word of God as well.
Yeah.
I wanted to...
I was going to say, Dr. Saib, it's not just celestial bodies. Even if you take something like, for example, mountains, natural phenomenon. Yeah. And if you just look at the verses that are in the Holy Quran about that. So again, in chapter 78, verse 7 to 9, Allah says in the Holy Quran, and have we not made the earth as a bed, and the mountains as pegs, and we have created you in pairs. So we can see just from these very, very simple verses that we're told that God has created the earth and the physical needs of man have been provided. If we look at the mountains, they've got stores of minerals, they've got stores of water, and also God has created mates for us in order that we can have children. So it shows that not only is God the creator, He is also the provider, because He's given us the machinery, the equipment, and that there's also a purpose to our life. So there's a much more deeper meaning about this, what's being said. It's not just about creation. It's not just about physical creation, that look, here's a mountain and that mountain's going to benefit you. There's obviously a guiding hand, the wisdom behind what God has given to us. At the time, we just see these as a big mountain. We don't realize how important that is to us, even from the perspective of how the mountain brings stability to the earth. So now that modern sciences realizes that these mountains provide some sort of stabilizing force for the crust of the earth, and they prevent the earth from shaking. But again, God has already mentioned that in the Holy Quran many hundreds of years before the scientists have realized this.
Amjad, I know you've quoted a number of references, and there's an excellent book that you referred to. Do you want to say a little bit, and really how Muslims have been studying the
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, Muslims have been studying the natural phenomena for literally thousands of years, and we have in the century some really prominent scholars. I know the French scholar Maurice Bucaille, he's written on the phenomena of nature and the Quran, but there's one particular book I like to mention, and the name of the book for our listeners is, if they've got pen and paper handy, they can note it down. It's called The Phenomena of Nature and the Quran. It's by Dr. Abdul Wadud. And it was published in 1971. It is the first edition. I take it there's a second edition out, and this is available from Sayyid Khalid Wadud publishers in Lahore. So they can obtain this copy and it's really got the length and breadth of all the phenomena of nature that the Holy Quran covers. It's thoroughly detailed, much more detailed than Dr. Morris Bukai's book, or for that matter, subsequent books that have been written by, is it Yahya Harun or Harun Yahya, I take it?
Yeah, the Turkish writer.
The Turkish writer.
Yeah.
So this is really a benchmark book, although it was published in the 1970s, but it's not outdated. It brings to point all those references that allude to the natural phenomena that Holy Quran alludes to. It's really magnificent work.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, from the Ahmadi Muslim point of view, the tafsir of the Holy Quran by the second Caliph, the detail he goes into all these as well. It's really, I mean, for me, when I was a young scientist going to university, my deep interest was in science and religion, and it was absolutely fascinating the insights that the second Caliph gave in relation to science and religion and how to interpret the different verses. And Arif, just to mention again, because we're a very friendly radio station, open to all friends, and I know Amjad, our friend, in relation to how the verses, because if listeners are looking at the numbers, they just need to understand that. I mean, Amjad, do you want to do that?
Well, in the convention that we're quoting, the first verse is taken as Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
Yeah.
So that's always the first verse in every chapter except one. So when we say, for example, chapter 24, verse 44, the first verse of that chapter is Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. But in some of the numbering conventions, that would be verse 43. But in our convention,
it's just important for people if they want to check that out, so they understand what they're doing. So really moving to really the origins of mankind and the creative story. So there's a lot. You mentioned some of the embryological developments. I mean, that was absolutely fascinating. And you also quoted, man was made from clay, etc., and then the embryological from sperm, embryological development. Another interesting concept that is presented in Islamic theology is that there's special things about clay, isn't there, in how you can mold it and shape it and whatever. And you mentioned earlier on, solar system came into being 4.6 billion years ago, and early cells were here around, 3.8 billion years ago with the first single cell prokaryotes, then the unicellular eukaryote cell, which is the common cell that we have, and then from there multicellular, and then animals, and so, etc. So there's it's sort of incredible way of describing how you can shape something, and with clay you can make a nice pot by shaping it. So the Holy Quran just gives that as an analogy, doesn't it? What do you think?
Oh, absolutely, because Dr. Sahib, you're quite right. I mean, the Earth, before there was biological evolution, it went through many other evolutions itself. There was a chemical evolution, and actually this is very much alluded to again in the Holy Quran. Before the chemical evolution, it talks about that. This is verse. Surah 40, verse 67 or 68, whichever convention you're following, and it says, "It is He who created you from inorganic matter." And this is, the clays. I mean, I did a bit of work when I was at university on clays, and clays actually are very good catalysts because they're not just, when we speak of clay, we think it's like one monolithic material. Actually, inside clays, there's loads of minerals, metals, inorganic compounds, and they act as catalysts. They facilitate reactions to take place. And so basically when the Lord says He created you from the potter's clay, it's not the clay itself really, it's the ingredients of the clay. And now clays are used in all sorts of catalysis in chemical and biological reactions. And
I'm a biologist and I get so excited when I
but for me that also has a deeper meaning, that obviously clay can change and can develop. So there's a physical development, but there's also a spiritual element to that.
Yeah.
So that the way that God has created you is obviously in your life you will progress physically. You will go from an embryo into a baby, into a human being, but also you will have the properties given to you at the time of creation, so that you can develop spiritually as well. And again, this substance, this clay, and the way it's described, gives you all of those properties to be able to do that.
One of the interesting things is, because we're coming to the end of the program as well, is that not only does it talk about clay, but it talks about, in places, dry ringing clay. And I must share this with you, because this was Sir Abir Rahimullah who actually brought this up to us, that specific bit is in relation to how the two main RNA, ribonucleic acid, and DNA, deoxy, they came up, which are central to our formation. I'll go too deeply for listeners if I go into that. But it's the dry clay that helped formation of these macromolecules, and then from them into cells and whatever. So there's just so much in the Holy Quran that it really is an eye-opener. I want to finish off, though, because there is clearly for Muslims a guidance that there is a life after this death on this planet, and that's an important part of what we learn in our lifetimes as well. So do you want to say a little bit before I round off, Amjad?
Well, the Holy Quran says that the Quran itself is a kitab, a book without doubt, but in the ancient literature the kitab also meant memory. So basically here it's basically not ending the process of that death itself consumes everything, there's nothing beyond it. Actually it's the continuation of collective memory. Our consciousness lives in the soul, and the soul carries on immense journeys in the afterlife, and that is basically, that's what it's trying to make you ready for. There are many sayings of the prophets that says, verily I'm just a wayfarer resting under a tree, there is a life, abundance of life after death. And so now there is a lot of work that's being done on subconscious and subconscious level. We know that the brain stays alive after death, and so on, and again that's, as they say, is another story.
Absolutely. So really trying to summarize our programs on cosmology and origins of mankind. We are fortunate we have the 9 months in our mother's womb. A lovely process from two cells coming together, and then one cell fertilized to a unique human being with a conscience, a soul, and whatever. And often the Holy Quran refers to mankind being made from clay. Well, that's almost the 3 to 4 billion years on earth of shaping and developing. Just as in the 9 months we shape the embryo, God shaped us from simple molecules to human beings, and how wonderfully the Holy Quran describes this. And the whole purpose of this is to say that there is a life after life on this planet. It's probably a different type of dimension, different universe. It's not the same physical universe. Our bodies will die and decay, but we will carry on and we will continue learning. And one day, inshallah, as we say, as Muslims, we will meet our Lord as well. I hope listeners have found this a fascinating journey. As a scientist, I say I get so excited and carried away, but that's what science does to you. But for us, our religion and our sciences, inshallah, will go hand in hand as Muslims, and we will continue to enlighten the world as some of our great scientists and saints and scholars have done so as well. So until our next program, thank you very much. Please don't forget, what's our hashtag, Arif? I always forget.
At VI Living History.
Living History, okay. Well, please do give feedback to us on our programs. We hope you found this useful. So this is your host, Dr. Mohammed Iqbal, saying Assalamu alaikum, and salams from Arif and Amjad as well.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu.